Less than 2 hours before 50% tariffs were set to hit $20 billion worth of Canadian goods, Donald Trump posted on social media that he had a deal. He paused the tariffs for 3 days. He called it very fair for both sides. And within minutes, Canadian officials were already telling reporters something that directly complicated that celebratory framing. Significant progress, not a finished agreement. Important work still to be done. Two governments describing the exact same moment in two noticeably different ways. And that gap between what Washington announced and what Ottawa actually confirmed is where this story really lives. If you want to understand what actually happened in the final 90 minutes before that deadline, why Trump's declaration of victory does not match what Canadian negotiators are willing to say publicly, and what still has to happen before this becomes a real agreement rather than a headline, stay with this, because the details here matter more than the announcement itself. This channel breaks down exactly these kinds of high-stakes financial standoffs as they unfold in real time, so hit subscribe now before we go further, because this story is still moving even as it is being told. Let's go back to where this specific countdown actually started, because the sequence leading into that final Tuesday night phone call explains everything about why the announcement landed the way it did. On July 20th, 2026, Trump signed 3 separate presidential proclamations, each invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a law so old and so rarely used that no American president had applied it to impose actual tariffs since 1949. The 3 proclamations targeted autos, dairy, and alcohol specifically. The auto proclamation pointed to Canadian import quotas that had pushed American vehicle exports north down by roughly 22% over the preceding year. The dairy proclamation pointed to Canada's supply management system, which grants the European Union more generous cheese access under a separate trade agreement than it grants the United States. And the alcohol proclamation pointed directly at the coordinated decision by Canadian provinces to pull American liquor off government store shelves, a protest that began in early 2025 and never fully reversed. Together, those 3 proclamations covered roughly 554 separate tariff lines and $20 billion in Canadian goods annually, an additional 50% duty stacked on top of whatever tariffs already applied, covering everything from cement to hockey sticks. The deadline built into that 30-day clock was August 19th, 2026, at 1 minute past midnight. For the weeks leading up to that deadline, both sides ran an intensifying schedule of meetings that steadily accelerated as the date approached. Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Canada's chief trade negotiator Janice Charette were effectively living in Washington through the second week of August, running back-to-back sessions with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer. By the middle of that week, LeBlanc and Charette had already met with Greer for the 4th time in just 3 weeks, an unusually intense pace even by the standards of a trade relationship that had spent the better part of 18 months locked in one negotiation or another. Sources close to those talks told reporters that the Canadian side had aggressively argued to their American counterparts that there would be no political appetite among Canadians to keep negotiating at all if the August 19th tariffs actually came into effect, a warning that functioned less like a threat and more like a statement of political reality, given how hardened Canadian public opinion around this specific dispute had become. To understand why Ottawa held that line so consistently through the final weeks, you have to understand the 18 months of history sitting behind this specific standoff. This was never an isolated dispute over dairy shelves and hockey sticks. It began back on February 1st, 2025, when Trump first imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, 25% on most imports and 10% specifically on energy products, citing fentanyl trafficking across the northern border. Canada retaliated immediately with tariffs that started around $30 billion and escalated within weeks to cover roughly $155 billion in targeted American products. Mark Carney, newly elected that spring on a promise to stand firm against exactly this kind of pressure, met Trump at the White House shortly afterward, in a session that set the tone for everything that followed, telling reporters directly that Canada would never be for sale, a comment Trump answered with a smiling, never say never. Over the following months, the relationship cycled repeatedly between de-escalation and renewed conflict. The two leaders agreed at the G7 summit in Kananaskis in June of 2025 to pursue a comprehensive deal within 30 days, a deadline that came and went without resolution. An August 1st target for 2025 also passed without an agreement, with Trump telling reporters at the time that Canada could simply be a country where there is just a tariff, not really a negotiation at all. Canada eventually dropped the majority of its own retaliatory tariffs that August as a gesture of good faith, a decision that drew sharp criticism from conservative opposition leader Pierre Poilievre, who accused Carney of breaking his central campaign promise and joked that the Prime Minister's elbows, a reference to Carney's own rhetoric about standing firm, had mysteriously gone missing. That criticism shaped how carefully Carney's government approached every subsequent decision in this negotiation. acutely aware that any further unilateral concession risked reinforcing exactly the narrative Poilievre had already built around him. By December of 2025, talks specifically aimed at resolving the steel, aluminum, and auto tariffs had actually come close to a resolution, only for Trump to freeze the entire process over an anti-tariff advertisement issued by the Ontario provincial government, pushing the sectoral question into what Carney himself described at the time as an uncertain future timeline tied to the broader review of the Continental Trade Agreement. That freeze meant Canada entered this specific Section 338 fight in July of 2026, having already watched one promising negotiation collapse over what amounted to a political grievance rather than a genuine economic disagreement. And that memory shaped exactly how skeptically Ottawa read every subsequent offer from Washington throughout August. This is your first real rehook because it explains why the deal that eventually emerged looked the way it did. Canadian officials signaled they were willing to offer real movement on some of the specific grievances named in the July proclamations, but every industry source close to the process made clear that movement would only happen inside a broader framework, one that also addressed the older, separate set of Section 232 tariffs already sitting on Canadian steel, aluminum, and autos, tariffs that had nothing to do with the alcohol shelves or the dairy quotas, but had become tightly bound to this negotiation anyway because Ottawa refused to treat them as a separate conversation. That refusal traces back directly to comments Prime Minister Mark Carney made publicly in early August, when he rejected the idea of a narrow, sector-isolated deal outright, telling reporters in Saguenay, Quebec, that Canada was not interested in a very targeted deal without connections to other sectors, and that Ottawa wanted a more comprehensive, more global agreement instead. That single decision shaped the entire remainder of the negotiation, and it is the reason the eventual outcome, whatever shape it finally takes, will end up looking considerably broader than the narrow deal Washington originally tried to sequence. Quick pause here because the mechanics of exactly how the final hours unfolded deserve close attention, and if you're finding this useful, this is a good moment to drop a like and subscribe, because what happened between Monday and Tuesday night of deadline week is the actual turning point in this entire story. On the Monday before the deadline, Carney and Trump spoke by phone. Carney's office would not release details beyond confirming the call had taken place, describing it only as a conversation about the ongoing negotiations. That same day, speaking in French at a public appearance, Carney described the state of talks as very intense and delicate, and said Ottawa had prepared plans to cover all eventualities if the 50% tariffs actually took effect as scheduled. That phrase, cover all eventualities, was widely read by political commentators covering the story as coded language for a package of Canadian counter-tariffs sitting ready to deploy, a signal that Carney's earlier rejection of a narrow deal had never been a bluff. If Washington would not move on the broader framework Ottawa had been demanding since early August, Canada was prepared to escalate rather than accept anything less. Then came Tuesday, the day the deadline was actually set to expire. LeBlanc and Charette sat with Greer for another extended session that afternoon, described afterward in a short statement as constructive, with negotiating teams taking stock of the work completed and confirming that discussions were continuing. Reporters shouted questions at Greer as he left that meeting. His answer was 2 words, no comment. LeBlanc's answer, delivered separately, carried more information packed into fewer words than almost anything else said publicly that entire week. We're going to continue working, he said. Our job is not yet done. Notice that phrasing carefully, because it turned out to be the single most accurate description of where things actually stood. Delivered hours before, Trump's own announcement suggested something far more finished had already been achieved. Charette went back to the United States Trade Representative's office that same evening to keep working with her counterparts late into the night. And then, shortly after 10 o'clock Tuesday night, with less than 2 hours remaining before the 50% tariffs were legally set to take effect, Trump posted directly to social media. He said he was pausing the tariffs for a 3-day period, based on the fact that Canada and the United States, subject to the finalization of documents, had a deal. He called it, in his own words on the post, a deal, in capital letters. He told reporters the following day that talks with Canada had yielded a very fair deal for both sides. He even added, almost as an aside, that the long-cancelled Keystone XL pipeline project, revoked years earlier by the previous administration over climate concerns, might be, in his words, awoken from the grave, posting an illustration of himself wrestling with a length of pipeline. Here's the part almost nobody watching the celebratory headlines fully absorbed in the moment, and it is the actual center of this entire story. Carney's own statement, released around the same time as Trump's announcement, used dramatically more careful language. While the two countries had made substantial progress, Carney said, "There's important work still to be done. Read those two statements side by side." Trump, "We have a deal." Carney, "Important work still to be done. Those are not the same claim, and the gap between them is not an accident of translation or tone. It reflects a genuine ongoing difference in how much of this negotiation is actually finished versus how much remains unresolved even after the public announcement landed. The following morning, Wednesday, August 19th, LeBlanc and Greer posted a joint message congratulating each other publicly on what they described as significant progress made in the trade negotiations between Canada and the United States. Carney responded to that post with his own message, congratulating both LeBlanc and Greer for the progress achieved. Notice, again, the specific word choice running through nearly every official Canadian statement issued around this announcement. Progress, not resolution, not a signed agreement, progress. Trade lawyers and political analysts covering the story immediately flagged that repeated wording as deliberate, a signal that the agreement, whatever its outline actually contains, remained genuinely unfinished at the moment it was publicly announced, and that reading was confirmed almost immediately by what happened next. Rather than the two governments moving to formalize a completed document, LeBlanc and Charette were back at the negotiating table with Greer again on Wednesday, continuing to work through details even after the tariffs had already been paused. The terms that had been agreed to on Tuesday night, according to reporting from inside the process, were terms Trump had personally accepted, but they were not yet terms that had been converted into an actual signed, legally binding document. That distinction matters enormously in trade negotiations of this scale, because a verbally accepted framework and a finalized legal text are two very different things. The gap between them is exactly where deals of this size have collapsed before, sometimes months after an initial announcement generated exactly this kind of positive headline. Carney, for his part, moved quickly to brief his own cabinet and Canada's provincial premiers on the outline of what had been agreed, telling them the emerging framework was designed to reinforce what he described as Canada's underlying economic advantage, specifically by securing the best possible terms in each of the country's most important strategic sectors and by providing greater long-term certainty about the overall trading relationship going forward. That briefing itself is a telling detail. A government moving to brief its cabinet and premiers on an outline, rather than simply publishing a finished text for everyone to read, is a government still managing a partially completed process, not one closing the book on a finished negotiation. The individual grievances behind the original Section 338 proclamations were also still, by LeBlanc's own account, only partially addressed even as the pause took hold. The Canadian side was said to be willing to offer meaningful movement on the specific irritants Washington had named back on July the 20th. The alcohol restrictions, the dairy access questions, and the auto quota dispute. But every industry source close to the negotiations made clear that willingness was always conditional on getting real, quantifiable relief in return on the separate Section 232 tariffs, not simply a promise that those tariffs would be discussed again at some later, undefined date. Whether that conditional trade actually made it into the final legal text remained, even as the pause was announced, one of the specific details neither government had confirmed publicly. Here's the part almost nobody covering this purely as a political win or loss fully explained, and it goes directly to why both sides had genuine incentive to reach for a pause rather than let the deadline pass unresolved. Section 338, the provision behind these tariffs, was chosen specifically because it required none of the procedural steps that slow down almost every other American tariff authority. No formal investigation from the United States Trade Representative, no national security determination from the Commerce Department, no congressional vote. The president simply determines that a foreign country is discriminating against American commerce, signs a proclamation, and 30 days later the tariff becomes automatic. That speed gave Trump the ability to set an aggressive deadline in the first place, but it also meant the underlying legal foundation for these specific tariffs remained almost entirely untested. No American president had used the provision to impose a tariff since 1949, and legal scholars were genuinely divided over whether it had even survived later trade legislation passed in 1962 and 1974. As of the deadline itself, no formal lawsuit challenging Section 338 had actually been filed, even though multiple trade law firms expected one soon after the tariffs took effect. A negotiated pause let both governments avoid finding out, at least for now, how a federal court might eventually rule on a legal authority nobody had tested in 3/4 of a century, which gave both sides an additional, quieter incentive to keep talking, rather than let untested law collide directly with a hard deadline. Here's a rehook worth sitting with, because it explains precisely what remains unresolved even after the pause was announced. According to LeBlanc, speaking directly to reporters in Washington, Canada's agriculture sector will be well protected under whatever emerges from this framework, and Ottawa maintained what he called its tough line throughout the negotiation. But that statement leaves an obvious and still unanswered question sitting right underneath it. Trump has publicly claimed that American farmers will get additional access to Canada's dairy market as part of this deal. Canada's supply management system, the structure LeBlanc says remains protected, is specifically designed to limit exactly that kind of foreign access in order to stabilize prices for Canadian dairy producers. Those two claims, additional American access and a fully preserved supply management system, are difficult to reconcile without much more specific detail than either government has released so far. Nobody outside the closed-door negotiating room currently knows exactly how that particular contradiction gets resolved in the final text, and until it does, describing this as a finished deal is, at best, premature. There is a second major unresolved question sitting alongside the dairy issue, and it may end up mattering even more to the Canadian economy than the agriculture question does. Canadian officials went into this entire negotiation specifically seeking relief on the separate, older Section 232 tariffs, already sitting on steel, aluminum, lumber, and autos, tariffs that were never part of the original Section 338 proclamations. But that Ottawa had insisted, since Carney's comments back in Saguenay in early August, needed to be addressed together with the newer threat rather than left for some undefined future round of talks. As of the announcement Tuesday night, it remained entirely unclear publicly what, if any, relief Washington had actually offered on those specific duties. Carney himself acknowledged this gap directly, saying the emerging agreement would provide greater certainty and would help preserve favorable terms for what he called Canada's key strategic sectors, while notably declining to specify exactly what tariff relief the United States had actually agreed to provide. That is not the language of a government that has just secured a clearly defined, fully quantified concession. It is the language of a government describing a direction of travel while the specific numbers are still being negotiated behind closed doors. Business groups reacted to the pause with a similarly cautious mix of relief and skepticism that mirrors exactly this uncertainty. Candice Lang, President and Chief Executive of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, said the delay itself provided real relief for both countries, since a full round of 50% tariffs taking effect would have caused immediate, tangible damage to companies already operating on thin margins. But she was equally direct about the limits of what a 3-day pause actually accomplishes. Businesses may not be closing up shop with this news, she said, but an extension does not bring the certainty that a signed interim deal would. This limbo state, she added, is not anyone's preferred outcome because time is genuinely of the essence for companies trying to plan shipments, pricing, and supply contracts around a trade relationship whose terms remain, even now, only partially defined. It is worth pausing on what those companies were actually staring down in the hours before Trump's post landed. Wood furniture makers like Canadell, which sells roughly 70% of its merchandise into American retail chains, had already been absorbing 25% tariffs on portions of its product line for over a year. A 50% duty stacked on top of that would have effectively doubled costs overnight on shipments that were already running on thin margins, forcing exactly the kind of choice that ripples through supply chains on both sides of the border. Absorb the cost, pass it directly to American consumers, or scramble to find alternative suppliers with almost no lead time to do so. Economic modeling, circulating among Canadian business associations in the days before the deadline, had warned that a full breakdown in negotiations could put over 100,000 Canadian jobs at risk. A figure business groups had been citing specifically to press Carney's government toward any workable resolution, even as public opinion inside Canada pushed the government toward holding a firmer line. That tension, real economic pressure to close a deal quickly on one side and hardened public sentiment demanding no capitulation on the other, is exactly what made the 3-day pause such an attractive outcome for Ottawa specifically. It relieved the immediate economic threat without requiring Carney's government to publicly accept terms it had not yet fully verified. Quick pause here again, because it is worth understanding exactly why a 3-day extension, rather than something longer, was the specific mechanism both sides settled on. And if you have found this breakdown useful so far, this is another good moment to like and subscribe before we go further into what happens next. A short pause like this one serves a very specific strategic purpose for both governments simultaneously. For Washington, it allows Trump to publicly claim a deal has been reached, generating exactly the kind of headline his administration wanted before the original deadline actually passed, without having to wait for the slower, more technical process of finalizing binding legal language. For Ottawa, a short pause avoids the political cost of appearing to have caved to pressure at the very last minute, while still buying Canadian negotiators the additional time they explicitly said, through LeBlanc's own words, they still needed. Neither side had to fully commit to the other's version of events yet, because the 3-day window functions as a kind of negotiated pause button rather than a final resolution, giving both governments room to keep working through the unresolved dairy and Section 232 questions, without either one having to publicly admit the deal was not actually finished when the initial announcement went out. Here's the numbered version of exactly where this negotiation stands right now, because there are enough distinct threads running through this announcement that it helps to separate them out individually. First, The 50% tariffs that were legally set to take effect at 1 minute past midnight on August 19th have been paused for 3 days, based on Trump's own description of a deal reached with Canada, subject specifically to the finalization of documents that, as of the announcement, had not yet been completed. Second, Canadian officials, from Carney's own public statement down through LeBlanc's comments to reporters, have consistently used more cautious language than Trump's own celebratory framing, repeatedly describing the outcome as significant progress rather than a finished agreement. Third, at least 2 major substantive questions remain publicly unresolved even after the pause was announced: exactly how Canada's dairy supply management system will coexist with Trump's claimed increase in American farmer access, and exactly what relief, if any, Washington has agreed to provide on the older Section 232 tariffs still sitting on Canadian steel, aluminum, lumber, and autos. Fourth, negotiating teams from both countries continued meeting even after the pause took effect, with LeBlanc and Charette sitting down with Greer again on Wednesday, specifically to keep working through the details that had not yet been locked into final legal text. And fifth, business groups on the Canadian side have welcomed the immediate relief the pause provides, while explicitly warning that a temporary reprieve is not the same thing as the certainty a fully signed agreement would deliver, meaning companies on both sides of the border are still, even now, planning around uncertainty rather than a settled outcome. There's a broader pattern worth recognizing here, because this is not the first time this particular relationship has produced exactly this kind of gap between an announcement and the underlying reality. Nearly 72% of Canada's total goods exports flow south to the United States, a concentration so heavy that, on paper, it should leave Ottawa with almost no leverage to resist whatever terms Washington eventually settles on. And yet the pattern of careful, deliberately unfinished language coming out of Carney's government this week shows a negotiating team still actively working to shape those final terms, rather than simply accepting whatever framework gets handed to them. Throughout the past 18 months, Trump has repeatedly used deadlines as pressure points, only to extend, pause, or reframe them at the very last moment, once genuine movement toward an agreement became visible. He extended earlier USMCA-related review timelines. He paused reciprocal tariff threats for 90 days back in the spring of 2025. He has shown a consistent willingness to treat a hard deadline as a negotiating tool rather than an absolute line, provided the other side shows enough movement to justify framing an extension as a victory rather than a retreat. Carney's government, for its part, has learned to read that pattern carefully over the same 18 months, which is precisely why Canadian officials have been so disciplined about avoiding premature declarations of success, even when the immediate crisis, 50% tariffs actually landing at midnight, has been averted for now. Canada has been burned before by treating an early announcement as a finished outcome, and the language coming out of Ottawa this week reflects lessons learned from exactly that kind of experience. That caution extends well beyond the specific deadline, too. LeBlanc himself, months before this particular standoff, had already been telling reporters and Senate committees that Canada would not accept any deal built around a flat baseline tariff, the kind of arrangement some other American trading partners, including the European Union and the United Kingdom, had already agreed to earlier in this broader tariff era. Canada, by contrast, has consistently pushed for something more specific, sector-by-sector treatment that recognizes the genuinely different economic relationships involved in steel, aluminum, autos, dairy, and energy, rather than a single across-the-board number applied uniformly regardless of the product. That preference for granular, sector-specific outcomes over a simple blanket rate is precisely why this particular negotiation has taken so long to produce even a preliminary framework. And it is exactly why Ottawa's caution about declaring victory after a single social media post makes strategic sense, rather than looking like simple stubbornness. A blanket tariff rate can be announced and confirmed in a single sentence. A framework built around a dozen individually negotiated sector-specific terms cannot, and everything reported publicly about this deal so far suggests it falls firmly into the second, more complicated category. What happens over these next 3 days will tell us far more than the initial announcement itself did. If negotiators actually manage to convert Tuesday night's verbal framework into a signed, detailed document covering both the dairy access question and the Section 232 relief question with real specificity, this becomes a genuine turning point in a trade relationship that has spent a year and a half lurching from one deadline to the next. If they cannot close that gap within the 3-day window, the entire cycle risks repeating itself. Another extension, another round of talks, another careful statement from Ottawa about progress rather than resolution, while businesses on both sides of the border continue absorbing the cost of uncertainty in the meantime. Either outcome is genuinely possible right now, and anyone telling you with total confidence which way this breaks within the next 72 hours is guessing rather than reporting, because even the two governments most directly involved in this negotiation are still, by their own public statements, working through exactly that question in real time. What is already clear, regardless of how these final 3 days resolve, is that the instinct to treat Trump's Tuesday night social media post as the actual end of this story would be a mistake. The pause bought time. It did not, on its own, produce a finished agreement. Carney's own words made that distinction plain within hours of the celebratory announcement landing, and everything reported publicly since then, from LeBlanc's continued meetings with Greer to the still unanswered questions about dairy access and steel tariffs, confirms that the real work of this negotiation is still actively underway, even as the headlines describe it in the past tense. There is one more detail worth sitting with before wrapping this up, because it captures the entire dynamic of this announcement more precisely than almost anything else said publicly this week. Trump's own post described the agreement as reached subject to the finalization of documents. That qualifying phrase, buried inside an otherwise triumphant announcement, is itself an admission that the deal, as of the moment it was announced, existed as an accepted framework rather than a completed legal instrument. Documents still requiring finalization can, in principle, still fall apart over details that seem minor from the outside, but carry enormous weight for the specific industries involved. A single percentage point on a dairy quota, a specific product category excluded from steel tariff relief, a timeline for phasing in whatever changes both sides have actually agreed to. Until those documents are finished, signed, and published in full, the honest description of where this negotiation stands is exactly the one Carney's government has been giving from the very start: significant progress, with important work still to be done. If this breakdown helped you understand what is actually happening underneath the celebratory framing this week, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the next 72 hours will determine whether this becomes a genuine resolution or simply the latest pause in a trade relationship that has already produced more deadlines than actual deals. Drop a comment below and tell us whether you think this framework holds and gets finalized, or whether we are looking at yet another extension once this 3-day window runs out. Share this with anyone who saw the headline about a deal and assumed the story was over, because based on everything both governments are actually saying on the record, it clearly is not. Thank you for watching, and we will be tracking exactly what happens the moment this 3-day window closes.